The last desperate attack by the Germans towards the end of the war. Operation Solstice. By the beginning of 1945, the situation for Nazi Germany had become critical. Hitler, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, handed over the military command to Himmler. The last serious attempt to turn the tide of the war was the Ardennes offensive on the Western Front, but it ended in complete failure. After this failure, the Führer finally lost hope of victory. Now his only strategy was to prolong the war in the East as much as possible in order to have time to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. The decision to transfer part of the troops from the Soviet-German front for the Ardennes operation turned out to be especially difficult for Germany. These forces were completely defeated in the West, while in the East the Red Army continued its rapid offensive. By February 1945, the Allied armies were approaching Berlin from different directions. In this situation, Hitler, true to his character, continued to look for some risky and adventurous solution that could save the crumbling Third Reich. In a desperate attempt to turn the situation around, Hitler developed Operation Solstice. This plan was extremely risky, not only from a military point of view. The most controversial decision was the appointment of Heinrich Himmler as commander of the Vistula Army Group, which caused sharp discontent among experienced military leaders, including the famous Guderian. A tense dialogue took place between Guderian and the Führer. The creator of the Blitzkrieg tactics insisted on the need to attach an experienced General Wenck to Himmler's staff, without whom the success of the operation was impossible. Guderian directly pointed out the Reichsführer's lack of combat experience and a competent staff for conducting a large-scale offensive. However, Hitler categorically rejected these arguments, forbidding even hints of Himmler's incompetence. Despite this, Guderian continued to insist on the appointment of a Wreath, realizing that only professional military leadership could provide at least some chance of success of the operation. That's what Guderian recalled. I remember this difficult conversation that lasted about 2 hours. Hitler stood in front of me, completely distraught with anger. His face was bloodshot, he was waving his fists and shaking his whole body, completely losing control of himself. After each fit of rage, he began to rush around the room, then abruptly stopped right in front of me, almost touching my face, and shouted new accusations. His scream was so violent that his eyes seemed about to pop out of their sockets, and the veins on his temples swelled and turned blue. I made a firm decision to remain calm despite all this onslaught. I listened to his attacks in silence and methodically repeated my demands. My only weapon in this situation was iron logic in a sequence of arguments. I understood that one should not succumb to provocations and lose one's self-control, even when the Führer was in such a state. Only composure and a rational approach could help me convey my position. Despite the hasty formation, the Vistula Army Group was an impressive force. It consisted of well-trained units of the 2nd, 9th, and 11th Armies of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS. The 11th SS Panzer Army, under the command of Felix Steiner, which was considered one of the best in the Reich at the beginning of 1945, stood out in particular. An illustrative example of the combat power of this unit was the SS Division Frundsberg, which numbered more than 20,000 people, including 432 officers and 3,470 non-commissioned officers. In total, the Army Group included 30 divisions and brigades, among which there were 8 tank divisions, fortress garrisons, and 8 combat groups. Support from the sea was provided by the German fleet from the ports of Gdynia, Danzig, and Kolberg, and from the air, about 300 aircraft. However, Soviet intelligence was not asleep. Due to air superiority, it was possible to detect the movement and concentration of large enemy forces. In response, Zhukov issued Directive Number 00813, according to which the Soviet troops occupied advantageous defensive positions and received the necessary reinforcements. On February 16, 1945, the decisive stage of Operation Solstice began. In the early hours of the offensive, Steiner's forces achieved notable successes. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they took Verben at Lake Marussi, and by 8 in the evening, they captured Schöningen. The 61st Army of the Red Army acted against the German offensive. Despite the rapidity of the attack, the Germans were unable to break through the defenses of the 12th Tank Corps of the Red Army. although the core was significantly weakened by previous battles. The Luftwaffe actively supported ground forces using small group tactics to attack Soviet positions. This seriously hampered the movement of our troops. At the same time, the 61st Army was fighting heavy battles for the city of Arnswolde, which the Germans were trying to unblock. The assault on the city was complicated by the lack of infantry and heavy artillery from the Soviet troops. The Germans successfully destroyed Soviet heavy IS tanks right on the city streets. The battles between the Royal Tigers and the Soviet S and IS-2 were especially heated, turning urban neighborhoods into the arena of tank duels. On February 17th at 1600 hours, German troops managed to break through the blockade of the city, breaking the resistance of the 80th Rifle Corps, which was experiencing a shortage of anti-tank weapons. However, the successes of the German army ended there. With each passing hour, their progress slowed down, and the neighboring tank corps stopped altogether, going on the defensive. The offensive operation began to develop according to the scenario of the Ardennes operation. On February 18th, Soviet troops launched their first counterattacks, and by the evening of February 19th, the German offensive had finally stalled. An order was received from the headquarters of Army Group Vistula to stop the offensive. Meanwhile, the Red Army began regrouping forces to storm the city of Arnswolde. The preparation took 2 days, and in the evening of February 21st, after powerful artillery training, Soviet troops drove the Germans out of the city. The remnants of the 11th SS Panzer Army were attached to the 3rd Panzer Army, which had to hastily retreat across the Oder to organize defense in anticipation of the Soviet offensive. As a result, the German army suffered a natural defeat in this operation. Even before the start of the Ardennes operation, which is in many ways similar to the Solstice, General Guderian expressed the opinion that in the current situation for Germany, it makes no sense to waste the remaining forces on achieving local successes. This seems especially pointless in the context of Hitler's master plan, which counted on the emergence of a conflict between the Allies and the Soviet Union. A more reasonable solution would be to focus from the very beginning on creating defensive lines on the Oder, and transfer the troops involved in the attack on the positions of the Red Army to strengthen the defense. Perhaps the reason for this decision lies in the fact that the Wehrmacht command still believed that it was dealing with the Red Army of the 1941 model, which could still be surrounded, confused by an attack from several directions, or broken by a powerful onslaught. However, in fact, the Red Army of the beginning of the war and the Red Army of 1944 to 1945 are, in fact, two different armies. What do you think about this?